Welcome to GS Podcast number 124. I'm Stephen Knight and I hope you're all well. Very pleased to bring you a conversation I had with Coleman Hughes. My wonderful Patreon supporters would have noticed that they received that episode quite a lot earlier than the standard release as a small thank you. And I'd also like to say a quick thank you to the following new Patreon supporters. Marcus Tavares, thanks Marcus. Chris Shell, cheers Chris. Philip Smeltzer, thank you Philip. Larry Wilson, cheers Larry. William Moore, thanks Bill. David Cooley, thanks David. Capitan B Miller, cheers. And last but not least, John Hirschfield. Your support really means a lot and it does help the production of the podcast and enables me to improve the sound quality, travel to more events and buy more scotch. So thank you very much. If you'd like to become a patron supporter and receive episodes earlier than the general release on occasion and get a shout out on the podcast, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. Alright, enough of that. More about Coleman Hughes. Really enjoyed our chat. Very smart and articulate young chap. Many of you may have seen his work now. He seems to have blown up in the in the time between me hitting stop on our recording and checking Twitter. I think Sam Harris had a discussion with him. I reached out to him at the end of June. I think I read an excellent article he'd put out in The Spectator called The Diversity Trap, and I thought this is somebody who's making a lot of sense but's taking an alternative position, or a position that's not really given much time or space in our mainstream discussion on the issue of race, on diversity, affirmative action, racism, things like that. And he seemed to make a lot of sense, so I wanted to get him on and talk to him. I've since discovered that he's a writer for Quillette, which makes perfect sense. Definitely check out his work there. And he seems to have blown up quite a bit since we recorded our conversation a few weeks back, which is great for me. But I just want to kind of make clear that it's not me jumping on an opportunity of someone who's popular at the minute. I had no idea he'd blow up the way he has, but I'm very pleased that he has. So make sure you seek him out on Twitter. You can find Coleman at ColdXman. There you have it, at ColdXman. Send him some love, send him some kind words, send him some feedback, some follow-up questions. Check out some more of his writing. I'm sure he'll be happy to hear from you. There's a lot planned for the remaining months of this year for me. I'm speaking at Mythicist Milwaukee on 2 panels there. Very interesting lineup of speakers. That's in September. You can grab tickets for that now. I'm also covering a few other events, which I'll share some details about closer to the time. And I may actually be speaking at somewhere else later on in the year as well. So I'm just working out the details of that now. Best way to keep up to date on this sort of stuff is go to gspellchecker.com. Put your email address in, subscribe to our mailing list, and I'll just spam you with adverts for Viagra. No, promise that won't happen. But you'll get a link to new blog post. Also, you can follow me on Twitter if you want. So enjoy this conversation with Coleman. I hope you'll find it enlightening. I asked some questions and listened and learned a lot, and I always go into these things thinking that if I ask questions and things that interest me, people who are listening will get something from it too. So let me know, leave some comments. Enjoy.
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell took across the God of creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those who don't know what it means. And he said, go A-T-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we know, just means we don't believe. And he keeps turning out these godless say, a reason shot.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Coleman Hughes to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. Coleman, how are you doing?
Doing very well, thanks. How are you?
Excellent. Really, really well. Thank you very much. I was really impressed with your article in The Spectator titled The Diversity Trap. A lot in there that I want to touch on. Interestingly enough as well, it acted as like a warning towards Great Britain. Before we get into that, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you do. How would you describe what takes up the bulk of your time?
Well, basically I read and I write. I tend to write long pieces especially for Quillette recently. I'm now a columnist there, although I freelance write for, as you said, The Spectator, the City Journal recently, and hopefully other outlets as well. But I'm a freelance writer, essentially.
What kind of advantage does that long-form style of writing have? I mean, on one hand, I suppose you can be more detailed and nuanced in the arguments you're making. On the other hand, you have to sort of entice people to read, a miniature novella. So, I mean, what's the trade-off there?
Well, the trade-off is that many people apparently don't have the attention span to read a 3,000-plus word piece, which I certainly empathize with. I think it's totally worth it, though, because when you're talking about a topic like race and diversity and historical injustice, these are extremely, extremely emotional and sensitive topics. And in my view, the more emotional and sensitive a topic is, the harder it is to treat in 900 words, because there are just all of these objections that are going to come to mind when you're making what will seem like a contrarian argument that you have to preempt and you have to deal with in a nuanced and sensitive way. And it's just, I find, absolutely impossible to do that in 900 or 1,200 words. So I think it's totally worth the trade-off in my opinion. And the longer pieces I've been doing for Quillette seem to have been getting an abnormally high amount of circulation for Quillette. So it seems like there is a market for nuanced and long form thought on this topic.
Oh yeah, it definitely seems like there's an appetite for it now. I mean, you're a black man delving into this murky water of diversity and racial bias and things like that. Do you think that increases your currency in this argument or devalues it in a sense? Do you think people are more likely to pay attention to what you're saying, or do you find that the responses can be quite disparaging because you're black?
I think it's more the first one. I think there are many white people who would agree with many of the points that I'm going to make here. Also, many black people who agree. But when you're making an argument that goes against the prevailing progressive narrative on race, and you're also a white person making that argument, in the eyes of many people, they will just write that off as a kind of either frank racism or as, at the very least, an insensitivity, a sort of not getting it.
Yeah.
Sort of not understanding the emotional history of historical racism, and just a sort of blind spot from the mere fact of your identity. And I even used to have many of these reservations when hearing white people talk about race. So I understand where it's coming from. So I think people are more willing to listen to the same exact argument when your skin happens to be darker, which obviously is not rational, but it just is the case.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose in a way, there's how do we deal then with the people who are just out and out racist and bigots, and who will seize upon your output and spin it to their own means? Is that something that's a concern for you at all?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I've already noticed it happening. From my point of view, it seems like I just have two choices here. One choice is to worry so much about true racists kind of picking up on my arguments, or really cherry picking my arguments, because that's what you'd have to do to like my writing as an actual racist. You'd have to ignore half of it. So I'm choosing between just worrying so much about that I end up just lying about what I think or not writing at all. I'm choosing between that and just saying what I think honestly and in a nuanced and responsible way, and accepting that some unsavory characters are going to cherry pick my writing and Right. So those are my two options, and neither one of them is perfect, but I prefer the second. And I don't think that the universe owes you perfect choices, right? Sometimes you just have two bad options and you have to choose the better of the two.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it, actually, especially the idea that, nothing should be as clear cut every time, especially when dealing with such complicated issues. And I was wondering as well, maybe you could tell me a little bit about how you feel we have the discussion in general on race, because it seems to me, and I can imagine people have different experiences as well, but it seems to me that we're living in a time where racism feels to me like it's on the decline, or certainly comparable to generations gone, yet we seem to be more and more obsessed with the topic of race compared to times gone. It seems to be a filter which is used to look at many issues which are sometimes unrelated to race. I just wanted to get your feeling on the general conversation surrounding race.
No, you're completely right that racism has been going down precipitously decade after decade in the entire 20th century and throughout the 21st. And poll data shows this. You just look at the number of people who would have been upset if their child married a black person in the year 1960. You get alarmingly high, like in the 80 and 90 percentile range. Now that's in the single digits. And I think most people know that, right? But this is the point the writer Shelby Steele has made, that the degree of outrage around racism doesn't vary with the objective level of racism in society, right? It actually varies with the level of guilt in society, because there are several facts that speak to this. One is just the fact that there's more activism in the year 1970 than in the year 1940, right?
Right.
If it were true that just the level of rage amongst African Americans and marginalized other marginalized groups was just a straightforward function of the amount of racism in society, you'd expect the opposite. And it would also be hard to explain why it's on campuses that you see the most outrage about racism, when campuses are objectively the most non-racist, anti-racist, most sensitive places on the planet, really, right? That's a fact that should strike people as strange, because it should be the exact opposite. It should be where there's the least racism, there's the least outrage about it, but it's the exact opposite.
Right. Maybe you could explain a little bit about what affirmative action is to my UK listeners, and what issues you have with that as a policy in general.
So affirmative action was a term coined in the late 60s. Originally, it meant a kind of outreach program on the part of institutions to find black students that wouldn't have otherwise applied to college, say, or wouldn't otherwise have known to apply to some given job, because black people were locked out of so many sectors of the economy. And essentially it was intended as a program to let them know that such opportunities were available and to get them to apply. Right? It was an outreach program.
Right.
By the early 70s, it had already morphed into a quota system where you're allotting a specific percentage of the population, whether that's in a college or in a business context, for blacks and Hispanics, and you're going to fill that quota regardless of how qualified the candidates are. And over the decades, the explicit quota systems have fallen away, but it still essentially takes that shape. These are programs that are committed to not using the same standards of entry for people of all races, to lowering the standards of entry for blacks and Hispanics in order to get whatever number of such students that an institution feels comfortable having.
So I suppose in a society or a system where individual freedom's the thing that's valued most, and we sort of remove systemic roadblocks for minorities, I don't think you're ever going to get sort of an equality of outcome. It just doesn't make sense that everything would be 50-50 anyway. But in a system where it's based on freedom, and we find that one group is disproportionately falling behind, I mean, it makes sense that there'd be some attempt to try and redress that, or at least investigate what's going on there. I mean, what would be a better solution if, say, black people perhaps over disproportionately represented in violent crime in the States? Now, we know that can't be related to skin colour. That argument wouldn't make any sense whatsoever, but there's something going on there. So how do we address this problem and speak about it openly?
Yeah, so now we're talking about just racial disparities in general. So I would say it depends on the racial disparity. On the crime problem, we should address that how we've addressed crime in every other community, which is by effective and humane policing, right? So the main reason that the black crime rate is higher in the U.S. is not anything unique to do with black people per se, but it's the fact that black communities have in fact been underpoliced for most of the history of the U.S. because eugenics was popular in the first half of this century. In every society on Earth, young men have killed each other until the police came in. That's just how young men tend to behave in the absence of the state monopoly on violence. And what went differently with black Americans was that the state monopoly on violence never fully came in, because the attitude among the racist white majority for so long was essentially, we'll police white communities and keep white men from killing each other. But if blacks are killing each other, it's a kind of a form of population control.
Wow.
So that was the attitude. And when that's the attitude, an honor culture is allowed to survive. And that's continued to survive today. And it continues to be the case that murders of blacks are far less likely to be solved than murders of whites, which means that, the relative of a black person who was murdered is now more incentivized to take the law into his own hands because he can't necessarily rely on the police to solve that murder. And there's also issues of black people distrusting the police in the first place. There's also an issue of the media pushing a particular narrative that the police are targeting black people, which contributes to the mistrust and makes blacks less likely to testify in court. And it's a bit of a vicious cycle. So a disparity like crime, for example, we should try to just marshal all the resources and all the wisdom we can to reduce the crime rate in every community, because crime is bad. Other disparities, it's not clear to me that, so for example, in the 20th century, far more musical icons came out of the black community than out of, say, the Asian American community, right? It's hard, besides maybe Yoko Ono, it's hard to name a massive Asian American or Asian musical icon, but most people could easily list 10 black icons, right? So, I mean, you could worry about that disparity. I don't think that's necessarily a disparity to worry about. So that's the spectrum we're dealing with. Crime disparities on the one hand certainly should be worried about. Arts disparities, I'm not sure are worth worrying about. Educational disparities, to the extent that they can be ameliorated, should be worried about. But we also shouldn't expect every demographic group, no matter how you're carving them up, to achieve the same results, because cultures differ for various reasons. Just like circumstances differ, historical circumstances differ, and it's often the case that the solutions, the top-down solutions that would seek to, and I'm sure we'll get into this in a moment with affirmative action, the top-down solutions that would seek to eliminate these gaps between races often have consequences that are sometimes worse than the solution they're attempting to solve.
And now I'm going to spend the rest of this podcast trying to think of Asian pop stars. You've really stumped me there. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Cultural difference. Right. I mean, what I found interesting in the piece that you put out for The Spectator is not, I mean, obviously, ostensibly, we understand that affirmative action's there to try and give people a peg up, try and help them achieve in an area where they may not otherwise. But you actually make a case that it can actually disadvantage the very people it's trying to help? Maybe you could explain a little bit about how it could lead to ill effects for them individuals.
Okay, so let's just start with an intuitive example, and then I'll give some statistics. The intuitive example is say you're a reasonably smart black kid applying to college, and you would have gotten into a pretty good, let's say, third tier school. But because of affirmative action, you get into a second tier school. So now the average kid at your school is smarter than you. You just begin to notice that every class you're taking, you're in the bottom half of the grade distribution, and you're just finding yourself struggling, okay? And let's say that you came into college wanting to do an engineering degree. So by your third year, you just find that the pace at which professors are going is too hard for you, and you decide to switch your major to English, something easier. Or you drop out altogether, okay?
Right.
That's a very intuitively plausible scenario. And there are many, many statistics to show that that this dynamic, which has been called the mismatch effect by Richard Sander, who is a UCLA law professor and wrote a book by the same name. He's marshaled many statistics to show that this is true. The most shocking one to me was at MIT, the average black undergrad was in the bottom 10% of math scores within that school, but was in the top 10% of math scores nationwide. So we're talking about one of the most, by any objective standard, one of the most talented math students in the nation, who could have gone to a very, very good school that was a little bit under MIT's reputation, but is now going to MIT because of affirmative action, and is in the bottom 10% of the school. Now that's a problem, I would argue, because I mean, not only you might worry about just what the cumulative effect of stereotypes is when the white and Asian students are just noticing that the black kids in every class seem to be lagging behind. So you could worry about that, but you could also worry about just the attrition rate, the non-graduation rate here, because almost a quarter of the black students in the class that was studied ended up not graduating MIT. That's a far, far higher attrition rate than for whites or for Asians. Okay, so you're putting black kids into an environment for which they are underprepared, and that's not necessarily good for them, right? And the second data point here is in 1996, the state of California passed, I believe it was Prop 209, which essentially ended affirmative action overnight. And so this is just a natural experiment in what would happen if it were ended. And what happened was this. At UC San Diego, the GPA gap, which was quite wide between blacks and whites and Asians, all but disappeared, because the next class of black students was being judged by the same standard to get in the door. And also the overall rate of blacks graduating with STEM degrees, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, increased by 51%. Because they're now students entering college intending to get an engineering degree are able to stay afloat in their classes because they're matched at the right institutions. So this is what happens often with social engineering of this kind, is that you don't anticipate the unintended consequences, and the solution can be worse than the disease.
So, I mean, you spend a lot of time talking about data there, which is great because you have the figures to back up the points you're making. What I found interesting about what you wrote in The Spectator was this revelation to me that the universities in question don't actually release their admissions criteria, or especially the way they select students.
That's right. They're extremely notoriously secretive about their admissions processes and about the GPA data broken down by racial group.
What's the motivation for not doing this? Is this because you feel they may be concealing data that would suggest this sort of thing is failing, or just the mere fact that they are possibly discriminating based on race and they wouldn't want that to be known?
Yeah, so I think it's all about the incentives facing college administrators and college presidents. And we can see this in the recent Harvard scandal that was widely reported in the New York Times and elsewhere, where some of their data somehow leaked, and they're now being sued by an Asian American advocacy group for essentially discriminating against Asian Americans. That's the other point of this that we should hit on. They found that if they were treating every racial group the same, the proportion of Asian students at Harvard would climb from 19% to 41%. So that is, and there are other studies that show that Asians have to score far higher to have the same odds of getting admitted into elite universities as black students, and they even have to score higher than white students.
There's obviously a push and pull effect. You're trying to push one group in and then you're pulling one group back at the same time with the same sort of system. So obviously Asian Americans seem to excel academically. That seems to be a spike on the statistics there. And how do we then, in that case, prevent, I suppose might be the right word, one group dominating in that sense? I mean, is that just the natural way of things? We should see where the chips fall in that sense, or is it a problem if one group has a monopoly in one area?
I don't think it is a problem, frankly. I mean, the parallel, I'm not the first to draw this parallel, but there used to be laws in virtually all of our elite colleges that put a cap on the number of Jews that could be admitted to universities because they were doing so well relative to other groups in the first half of the 20th century. And indeed, some of these laws were still on the books throughout the 60s.
Wow.
So is that a problem? I don't think it's a problem. You know, I don't think there is anything inherently problematic about one group dominating some particular activity. Black people absolutely dominate NBA basketball and make exorbitant sums of money. Right? I don't think that's a problem. Okay, we might worry that it's a problem that people are underachieving in education generally, if the reasons for their underachievement can be fixed without creating worse consequences, which I would argue they can amongst blacks. So the problem isn't that Asians are dominating at this moment. It's great that they're doing well. We should all be happy about that. The problem is that blacks aren't doing as well as they could be on the whole, on average. And I think we should be concerned about the root causes of black underachievement, and we shouldn't be concerned with going to the symptom of the problem and essentially just curating a kind of superficial diversity and pretending as if that is solving the underlying problem.
So what would you identify as some of the root problems then in black underachievement, as you've termed it?
So I think just like some cultures produce or do a far better job of teaching music to children, some cultures do a better job of teaching niche activities like beer brewing, among Germans, for example, historically at least. Some cultures do a much better job of inculcating the value of education than others. And the value of education is not obvious. It's not something we're built innately to do. It's actually very counterintuitive to understand why it matters to sit still in class for 6 hours and add up numbers, right? This is something that clearly Asian American culture is doing better than, for instance, white American culture. And we have every reason to believe that white American culture is doing this, insofar as you can talk about that culture as a monolith, which I'm not claiming it is doing generally a better job of this than black American culture is. We know, for example, that holding socioeconomics constant, a black household has fewer books in it than an analogous white household. We know also that black kids, especially in their teens, get routinely accused of acting white if they show an interest in academics. This happened to me, and there are various books that document this phenomenon. Barack Obama and Michelle Obama have talked about being accused of acting white growing up. So there's that to contend with. We know that black kids spend less time on their homework than white kids, and obviously it's not the kids' fault. We should be holding parents accountable. But we also know that black kids are far, far more likely to grow up in single-parent homes. And as a single mother, it's hard to work and get your kids to study and do all of the parenting work that two parents can do. So those are the root problems in my view. And it's not to say if all of those were solved that we would see identical rates of college enrollment or college graduation or GPA. But I think the problem could certainly be substantially ameliorated if we had an honest conversation about those underlying cultural features.
How close do you think we are then to having this conversation in a mainstream sense? Because it seems like it's people like you who are writing for Quillette and doing long form conversations outside the mainstream sphere that are talking the most sense on these issues, but it doesn't seem to be embedded within our news media or our mainstream conversation. I mean, you try and host a conversation similar to this one at a campus, as you've just mentioned, who are overtly anti-racist in their viewpoints, and you can imagine disruption, protests, and attempts at deplatformation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you think there will be a point where people will catch up and start speaking about this sensibly, or do you think it's just a fool's errand to try and cut through all the noise?
I don't think it's a fool's errand. I think we're very far, though. So I think there's a kind of modernity bias that crops up here. For example, if you take the long view of history, in the first half of the 20th century, it was mainstream progressive wisdom that blacks were inferior in an essentialist genetic sense. Yeah. That race was a very important essentialist concept, and that which is to say, eugenics was a progressive idea. In fact, it was a progressive orthodoxy in the first half of the 20th century. So in the second half of the 20th century, the idea that racial discrimination explains every single disparity between blacks and whites was progressive orthodoxy. Now, you just imagine the massive difference between those two orthodoxies, right? That's in the span of a few decades that happened. There's absolutely no reason to assume that we couldn't have an analogous transformation in many decades where it becomes kind of taken for granted that cultures differ, and that it's not racist to notice those differences and to worry about them and to want to change the specific cultural elements that are unhelpful. I see no reason why that cultural awakening could not take place, given progressive orthodoxies will change whether or not we want them to. We know this historically, but we have this kind of bias towards the orthodoxies that happen to be ascendant at this moment, and to assume that they kind of won't change, but they will change. It's just a matter of what will they change towards.
Yeah, I think that's a positive outlook on it. I mean, I think we sort of circled this briefly before, and there's a lot of identity politics wedded into this argument as well. And we often find that those shouting loudest, pretending to represent a particular group. I mean, I suppose you could think of a trans activist could fit this mold. A lot of the times they're not transgender themselves, but they're shouting for change and trying to have policies change and things like that. And we often find that a lot of these things are not actually supported by the very communities they claim to be fighting for, and that's something that you've claimed with affirmative action as well, and admissions processes based on ethnicity and such. I think you said it's something that's not particularly popular amongst black people either.
Yeah, it depends. It depends with which poll you trust, but I'm just going off Gallup polls because they seem to know what they're doing. And it also depends how you ask the question. So if you ask, do you support affirmative action? You'll get majority support among blacks and whites. But if you ask the question, do you think race and ethnicity should have anything to do with one's admission, even if the goal is to increase diversity, you will get a minority support in fact, you'll get majority rejection amongst both blacks and whites, which is interesting because those are synonyms. Affirmative action is synonymous with considering race as a factor, right? So that suggests to me that, first of all, affirmative action is a euphemism. It is a kind of almost Orwellian euphemism because it entails racial discrimination. It is a policy of preferring certain races over others. That's a straightforward statement of fact. So when you ask people if they support affirmative action, quote unquote, you get relatively high levels of support. But if you ask them the straightforward definition of what affirmative action is, you will get minority levels of support, even amongst blacks, which suggests to me that this term affirmative action kind of has a political halo around it, where it's sort of unchallengeable, but very few people actually like the content of the policy.
I think you mean we spoke a little bit, well, mostly about America here because that's the area you're more familiar with, but you think that Britain in particular is sort of falling into the same trap in terms of our discussion and policies surrounding diversity, and what are some of the ways that have flagged up to you that it indicates we may be following in the same footsteps?
Well, frankly, I'm not super familiar with the British context, but the reason that I sort of wrote that piece as a warning was I was reacting to a news story with the American writer based in the UK, Lionel Shriver, who got into trouble for objecting to Penguin Random House, the publishing company's new diversity policy, wherein they, I believe it was by the year 2025, they set a goal to have their staff perfectly reflect the UK census along every dimension: race, gender, religion, disability, etc.
Good luck.
Exactly. Lionel Shriver essentially, she said in the pages of The Spectator, this is nuts. Don't do it. This is really bad. You should be the quality of publishing will suffer if you prioritize identity over competence, which is an obvious point to many people. She got booted off of a judging panel for the magazine Mislexia for those comments. So I was reacting to what I viewed as just the crazy moral panic that would lead someone to boot Lionel Shriver, a renowned female author, novelist, off of a panel judging a essay competition at a women's magazine for making what many people would view as totally rational criticisms of a misguided policy.
Yeah, it's funny how we're all for empowering strong female voices as long as they say the things we want them to.
Yeah, exactly. So, the commitment is razor thin once a member of a minority group doesn't take the progressive line.
Sure. So, I suppose we live in a climate as well where a lot of our organisations and companies and businesses have to be seen to be towing the line to sort of LGBT politics or sort of racial politics in the fact that they're progressive, they're supporting these things. And for a company to be neutral on this really is almost a tacit admission of racism or bigotry to the people who are observing, people who are misinformed, should we say. So, is there a case that businesses are feeling pressured by the mainstream discourse to start championing diversity and saying they're in support of these things whereas it might be more helpful to them things just to remain neutral?
Yeah, like I said, we started talking about this earlier. The incentives facing administrators and presidents of institutions are similar to the incentives facing politicians in that they're worried about the news story that's going to come out tomorrow about them. And that's going to, if they're a TV show, that's going to force the advertisers to pull their money, the donors to pull their money, whatever it is. They're worried about the bad press. And from their point of view, it's totally rational to be worried about the bad press because those are the incentives facing them.
Yeah.
How many times has has the news story come out that somebody said something racist behind closed doors. I mean, we're calling a news story now where was it? Oh, okay. This is Papa John's. The CEO or co-founder of Papa John's. Did you hear about this story?
I did. Yes. Was that a conference call?
Yeah, it was a conference call. He said the N-word.
Right.
Not the phrase N-word, but he said the actual word. But he was not calling it. He was not calling a black person the N-word. He was in fact, he was recalling having grown up hearing deplorable racists use that word, right? So he was using the word to call out racism. It was utterly clear the context in which he was using it, right?
I have this row all the time on Twitter because it's all about the context, isn't it? I mean, otherwise it's sort of to say that you can't say that word in any circumstances to just to enforce a sort of secular blasphemy law in a sense. Yeah.
It was, and it was utterly clear the context he was using in this case, and he had to leave Papa John's.
Wow. I mean, didn't something happen to somebody at Netflix as well? I mean,
same exact thing happened at Netflix. Yep.
So we don't even care to learn a person's meaning or intent anymore. It's simply that word is such a trigger that it's an instant red line for people. Which it seems. I mean, I know this word doesn't hold as much weight in the UK as it does in America for obvious reasons, but it's still socially unacceptable. But it does feel like a step backwards in the sense that there seems to be a more sort of renewed focus on this word in recent years in the States, if I'm not mistaken. I'm
not sure that it's renewed. I think it's as bad. Okay, well, here there's a story from the 90s where an aide to the mayor of, I believe, Washington, D.C., said a totally different word, the word niggardly.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Which is, you may have heard this, it's spelled Niggardly, and it's a synonym for stingy. And linguistically, it has absolutely no relation to the N-word whatsoever. In fact, I think I remember learning this word in preparing for the SAT college entrance exams here. Anyway, the aide, he said this word, and there was a black person in the room who took offense, and the aide had to step down. Totally unrelated word. So yeah, I don't think it's gotten better. I think it's about as bad as it has been since certainly the 70s, I'll say.
Yeah, it does seem a flashpoint, that word. So, I mean, we were having this conversation in the context of a Trump presidency, and the news surrounding that and the popular rhetoric is that he's emboldened the racist and the fascist to come out of the woodwork. We had horrible, concerning and deathly scenes at Charlottesville, and I just want to get your opinion on that. I mean, where does that fit in the landscape of things? Is there a big resurgence of white supremacy due to the election of Trump? Is it being overblown? What's your feeling on the situation?
The data I've seen indicates that whatever racist backlash there is, it is not a resurgence in the sense that it's not something where the trend lines are going to continue to go up, because the backlash is entirely, for the most part, amongst the elderly. Young people are hugely skewing democratic, anti-racist, and progressive, which means just with generational turnover, there's no reason to expect anything other than for racism to continue to decline. Whatever black backlash there is, it's very much disproportionately in rural populations, and people are continuing to move to cities at higher rates. So there's every reason to expect that this is a backlash rather than a resurgence. And while one should always stay vigilant, there's no reason to expect that this is going to be an increasing problem rather than a decreasing one.
Would you categorize Trump as somebody who's a racist per se? I mean, I know that's a very complicated question given his rhetoric, but I'm very careful with throwing around the word racist, and I often need a very cast iron example. And it seems like a lot of the people I converse with who who are calling Trump a racist, when they can't seem to provide me with this cast iron example of where we can point the finger at the man and say, yes, he's without doubt an out and out racist. So I just wanted to get your opinion on the man's character in that sense.
I don't like Trump's character one bit.
Yeah.
I think he's extremely thoughtless. I think he's not the type of personality that is likely to make for a good president. And there haven't been too many policy disasters aside from perhaps the child separation. Although I think they were actually bound by rules decided under the Obama administration by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So, is he a racist? You never know what's in a person's heart, but I have not been thinking of him as an out and out racist.
I mean, that's exactly the opinion I have. I would not be surprised tomorrow if we heard a leaked recording of him just going off on an N-word laden rant.
Right.
But because it's not there, I have a hard time with pinning that label on it. Just to be of that viewpoint instantly gets you a very angry level of incredulity that's hard to reason with.
Right, and something like one out of every 10 black men who voted for Trump. Are they voting for a racist? Frankly, if he were a racist, how relevant would it be, given that anti-racism is clearly the dominant culture in America, and his presidential powers are highly constrained. Again, I don't see the clear evidence yet that he's a racist. He certainly could be. It would not surprise me. But I don't totally think that it's worth worrying about too much.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly balanced view on that. I mean, what do you say to the argument as well? People will often say, well, if we have this increase in identity politics, specifically black identity politics in terms of Black Lives Matter, there's going to be an opposite reaction in that sense. So you might see more white nationalism as a response to that. And do you think that's a plausible scenario there? Are people just trying to make excuses for white nationalism? What's your take on that?
I think that's a totally plausible scenario. I think, if you look at the argument that someone like Jared Taylor makes, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he is a fairly popular white ethno-state, a white nationalist, essentially. The argument he makes is utterly clear. It basically has one premise, right, which is look at the fact that black people can organize around their race politically. We have the Congressional Black Caucus, which vets every piece of legislation, not for whether it's good for America, but whether it's specifically good for black people, right? They get to do that. Why don't we get to do that? Okay, that argument, it's based on a bad premise, which is that identity matters. But once you grant that false premise, the rest of the logic falls into place. Right. So, imagine you're, a young white man who, isn't super into the whole black identity politics thing, and you feel a little disgruntled about it. And let's say you've been passed over for a job because of some diversity initiative, which happens all the time. And then someone like Jared Taylor comes along and says, listen, all I'm asking is for white people to do exactly what every other ethnicity gets to do. Why is that unfair? That's a compelling argument. It's not right, but it's compelling once you grant the first bad premise.
Well, I do have some questions from Twitter for you, if you're happy to answer those as well.
Sure.
Jan Skelton, she's asked a couple that I think a number of them we've covered, but one interesting one which we haven't touched on. She's asked, is white privilege a useful concept?
If you mean white privilege as a sort of blanket, it's almost metaphorically a sort of gas that fills up the entire space of a country, such that in every environment you're in, being white confers on you an advantage. No, I think that is a totally useless concept. I know as a black person, I've been in spaces where my being black was not totally an advantage, but I've been in other spaces where my being black was very much an advantage socially. If there are 1,000 axes along which you can be privileged or not privileged. If you're a tall person, studies will show that, if you say the same sentence, you might be taken more seriously. Or if you have a deep voice versus a man who has a very high voice, or if you have a symmetrical face versus an asymmetrical face. Like I said, there are 1,000 axes along which you can be privileged or underprivileged, and it's good to be short when you're on a plane, but it's not good to be short when you're on the basketball court. Likewise, it's good to be black when you're applying to college. Not necessarily good to be black if you're in the kind of backwater country area going to some restaurant, and the waiters are taking longer to serve you because they make assumptions about you. So no, I think if you're talking about very, very local and very specific contexts, you can talk about white privilege and black privilege if you want. Just like you could talk about tall privilege, short privilege, male privilege, female privilege. But if you're gonna treat it as if it's a gas that fills up the container it's in, and that container is an entire country, I think that's a useless concept.
Yeah, I mean, being white, I have sort of a feeling that obviously there are certain situations where that's an advantage, and obviously my experience is different because of that. But I often see when people invoke white privilege, it doesn't ever, to me, seem to be presented in an argument. It just seems like another way of saying shut up, as far as I can see at the moment.
Yeah, and that's how it's used in many cases. Imperfect
Idea has asked, what's your advice when talking with close friends and family on the other side of these arguments?
That's a tough question. I think this goes for any hard conversation on any topic. Always show that you understand the argument that you're disagreeing with. It often helps to just repeat it in your own words. That can help. Obviously, not raising your voice or getting defensive can help. Taking deep breaths or practicing something like mindfulness meditation, which I do, can help to keep cool in such situations. Besides that, seeking to be as non-inflammatory as possible. I mean, I often find that my face-to-face arguments tend to go quite well. Yes. Actually, when it's one-on-one or the three people in a room chatting, we have all of these sort of instincts and intuitions socially that come online that are sort of conflict averse. When it can go wrong is anything online and anything where there's sort of a public audience where one's reputation seems to be at stake and one stands to lose social status. Those can get nastier, it seems to me.
I think that's something that betrays the debate format, doesn't it? At the moment, it seems like people are more interested in sort of point scoring and saving face, whereas there's an interesting discussion that could be had there if it was just approached in a different way. I mean, that's one of the reasons when I started podcasting that I decided that it wasn't going to be a debate format per se. I mean, I'd get people on with different viewpoints and different opinions and have them talk it out, but I'd try and keep it discussional and conversational. And I think people find middle ground easier or are able to express themselves in a way that isn't adversarial in that format.
Agreed.
Okay, Coleman. Well, this has flown by. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. You've been very lucid, very rational, a lot there to think about and for me to look into as well. Is there anything else you'd like to get across to my listeners before I let you get back to your day?
No, I mean, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I tweet sometimes. My handle is @coldxman, spelled COLDXMAN. And I'm a columnist for Quillette, so you can go to Quillette.com and search for my name, Coleman Hughes, and read my columns there.
Excellent. I'll definitely point people towards them. How do you find Twitter in general? Are you one of these people who's got that habit down, or is it something that can drag you into the swamps every now and then?
Every now and then I get dragged into the swamps. In general, I don't tweet very much. I retweet good articles.
I need to be more like you, I think. Okay, Coleman. Thank you very much for joining me. Most appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to the Godless Spell Checker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation, produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?